the Yamnaya. The year is 3000 BCE. You are standing on the Pontic-Caspian steppe, a flat, wind-scoured grassland so vast that storms announce themselves 2 days before they arrive. There are no cities here, no monuments, no writing. Just grass, wind, cattle, and a people whose name we don't even know for certain, a people who left behind no texts, no temples, no legends that survived intact. What they left behind was something far more intimate and far more disturbing. They left themselves. Inside. You. Right now, if you have any European ancestry at all, somewhere between 40 and 75% of what makes you genetically, you came from these people. And the way it got there, according to the ancient DNA record, was not peaceful. Geneticist David Reich at Harvard Medical School and Wolfgang Hack at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology published a landmark study in Nature in February of 2015. They analyzed ancient DNA from 94 individuals spanning 8,000 years of European and steppe prehistory. What they found rewrote the origin story of an entire continent. The Yamnaya, a pastoral people from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, contributed a sudden, explosive surge of ancestry into Western and Northern Europe beginning around 2900 to 2500 BCE. Before that surge, steppe ancestry in Western Europe was essentially zero. After it, it was everywhere. The numbers are staggering. In bell beaker culture sites across Britain, dated to approximately 2450 to 1800 BCE, Yamnaya-related steppe ancestry accounts for up to 90% of ancestry in some male individuals. Archaeologist Ian Armitt of the University of Bradford described the genetic turnover as one of the most dramatic population replacements in European prehistory. The Neolithic farmers who had built megalithic monuments across the continent for 3,000 years were, genetically speaking, nearly erased within a few centuries. The Yamnaya buried their dead in distinctive earthen mounds called kurgans, often with ochre-stained bones, wagon wheels, and animal sacrifices. Over 10,000 such burial mounds have been identified across the steppe from Romania to Kazakhstan, making them one of the most archaeologically visible prehistoric cultures on Earth despite leaving almost nothing else behind. Their diet, confirmed through isotopic analysis of skeletal remains, was composed almost entirely of animal protein consistent with mobile pastoralists who followed herds across the steppe for thousands of miles. They possessed genetic variants associated with lactase persistence, the ability to digest milk into adulthood, giving them a caloric and strategic advantage over the grain farming populations of Europe. They could drink their herds. The farmers they displaced largely could not. David Anthony, in his 2007 book, The Horse, the Wheel, and Language, argued persuasively that the Yamnaya are the most likely vector for the spread of Proto-Indo-European language, the ancestor of virtually every European language spoken today, from English to Spanish to Russian, and even extending east to Hindi and Bengali. The language spoken in London, Buenos Aires, and Mumbai all traces through ancient branching to people who lived on a flat grassland and left no written word. A 2019 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences by Wolfgang Hack and colleagues found something that stopped researchers cold. The steppe ancestry surge into Europe correlated with a near-simultaneous collapse in the genetic diversity of Neolithic male lineages, specifically Y chromosome haplogroups. The maternal line, the mitochondrial DNA passed from mother to child, was replaced far less completely. Johannes Krause at the Max Planck Institute noted that the Y chromosome bottleneck visible in this period is, in his words, without parallel in the modern human record. the replacement moved overwhelmingly through the male line. That is the genetic signature not of a gradual migration, not of two populations slowly blending, but of something far more asymmetric. Something in which incoming males reproduced at vastly higher rates than resident males. Osteological analysis of Yamnaya skeletal remains shows they were among the tallest prehistoric populations ever recorded in Europe, averaging approximately 5 feet 10 inches for males, significantly taller than the Neolithic farmers they displaced, who averaged around 5 feet 5 inches. In a world before firearms, height, reach, and physical mass were not trivial advantages. A 2015 study also found evidence of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for bubonic plague in European Neolithic skeletons from this period, suggesting epidemic disease may have swept through the continent before the Yamnaya arrived, creating a demographic vacuum into which they expanded. Verify plague dates and skeletal sample specifics. Mainstream archaeology frames the Yamnaya migration as a complex multi-causal event: ecological pressure, mobility advantage, and opportunistic migration into a plague-depopulated landscape. David Reich and others present it not as invasion, but as the messy, undirected outcome of a world in flux. The farmers didn't disappear overnight. The mixing was real, even if incomplete, and nobody planned it. That is the careful, responsible interpretation, and it is probably largely correct. But it doesn't explain the asymmetry. Plague doesn't selectively kill men. Migration doesn't preferentially involve only males. The Y chromosome bottleneck, the near-total replacement of the paternal lineage while the maternal lineage survived at higher rates, points toward something more targeted. Some researchers ask, was this organized violence, raiding cultures on horseback, systematically eliminating competing males and incorporating women into a new social order? Was it something for which we don't even have a modern category? The data doesn't answer. It only shows the result. A continent's worth of men, genetically speaking, were replaced. The women, partially, remained. And from that asymmetry, every Indo-European speaking culture on Earth eventually descended. 3 questions remain without satisfying answers. First, was the Yamnaya expansion deliberate conquest, opportunistic migration, or something else entirely, some process that our modern frameworks don't yet have the vocabulary to describe? Second, what were the lives of the Neolithic women who survived the replacement actually like, and what did they understand about what was happening to their world? Third, if the Yamnaya are the ancestral population of nearly every person who speaks an Indo-European language today, what does it mean for the history we tell about civilization's origins, a history that almost never mentions them? From the ghost people who rewrote Europe's genetic map, we descend into stone, into a Siberian cave where 3 species of human once sheltered from the same cold, and where a fragment of bone no larger than a thumbnail cracked open the entire story of what it means to be human, the Denisovans. The year is approximately 50,000 BCE. The Altai Mountains rise from the southern Siberian steppe in a landscape of pine forest, glacial rivers, and limestone outcroppings riddled with caves. In one of those caves, at an elevation of roughly 700 meters, something is living. Not Homo sapiens, not Neanderthals, though they are there too. Something else. Something that will not be known to science for another 50,000 years, and when it finally is discovered, it will be from a piece of bone so small that a child could hide it under a fingernail. In 2008, Russian archaeologists excavating Denisova Cave in the Altai region found a bone fragment from a juvenile individual. Sex indeterminate, species unknown. The fragment was sent to Svante Pääbo's team at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig. In 2010, Pääbo's team published a mitochondrial genome sequence in Nature. What they found matched neither modern humans nor Neanderthals. It was something else entirely. A third human species, previously unknown to science, identified entirely from a fragment of a child's finger. Pääbo would go on to win the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2022, in part for this discovery. The nuclear genome, published in 2012, was sequenced to a coverage depth of 30 times higher resolution than the genome of many living people today. They're from a finger bone and a single molar found in the same sediment layer, dated to approximately 50,000 to 30,000 BCE. Scientists reconstructed a complete picture of a human lineage that had been invisible to history. Verify date range. And then the real revelation came. Denisovan DNA didn't just exist in a Siberian cave, it was inside living people. Melanesian and Aboriginal Australian populations carry approximately 4 to 6% Denisovan ancestry in their genomes, higher than the Neanderthal admixture found in most non-African modern humans, which sits around 1 to 2%. Verify percentages. The most consequential piece of Denisovan genetic inheritance is a variant in the gene EPAS1, present in approximately 80% of modern Tibetans and almost entirely absent in Han Chinese populations. This variant regulates hemoglobin production at extreme altitude, allowing Tibetans to survive where lowland humans' blood thickens and their hearts begin to fail. It is, in the most literal sense, a Denisovan superpower absorbed into the modern human genome through interbreeding and then selected for by the brutal filter of living at 15,000 feet. Without the Denisovans, the Tibetan plateau may never have been populated. In 2019, a team led by Fahu Chen of the Institute of Tibetan Plateau Research identified a Denisovan mandible, a jawbone, recovered from Baishia Kars Cave on the Tibetan Plateau at an elevation of 10,760 feet, dated to at least 160,000 years ago. This was not a Siberian population. This was a species ranging from Siberia to the highest habitable landscape on Earth, across an area that dwarfs any other known hominin territory, and yet they left almost nothing behind. In 2018, a bone fragment from Denisova Cave was identified as belonging to a first-generation hybrid individual, a female whose mother was a Neanderthal and whose father was a Denisovan. Yet the probability of encountering such a direct generation hybrid by random sampling was calculated as vanishingly small, leading Pääbo's team to conclude that interbreeding between the two species was not a rare accident, but a relatively routine occurrence when the populations were in contact. Two species of human meeting in a cave and producing children. That child's bone is sitting in a laboratory in Leipzig right now. Sediment DNA alone, without any skeletal material at all, has established Denisovan occupation of Denisova Cave spanning approximately 200,000 years. They are one of the most geographically expansive hominin populations ever documented, ranging from Siberia to Tibet to Southeast Asia, and they have left exactly 4 skeletal specimens: the finger bone, 3 teeth, and the Tibetan jaw. Their tools, and if they made distinctive ones, cannot be reliably identified. Their art, if they created it, has not been found. Their language is beyond recovery. They are known almost entirely through what they left inside other people. Analysis of ancient proteins in the Denisovan molar by Frida Welker and colleagues in 2019 found enamel proteins clustering closer to Homo heidelbergensis than to either modern humans or Neanderthals, suggesting a lineage that may have diverged from our own branch over 400,000 years ago. Verify. a species older than Neanderthals, ranging across all of Asia, interbreeding with our ancestors at multiple points in multiple locations and vanishing so completely that we found them not from a skull or a skeleton, but from a fragment of finger in Siberian dirt. Mainstream science accepts all of this. It is peer-reviewed, Nobel-validated, and increasingly refined with each new sediment sample and genome sequence. The consensus is that Denisovans occupied eastern Eurasia while Neanderthals dominated the West, and that modern humans encountered both as they migrated out of Africa. The interbreeding was real. The genetic legacy is measurable. But if Denisovans ranged across all of Asia for 200,000 years, they should have left a massive archaeological record. Where are their sites? Where are their fire pits and tool caches and burial grounds? Some researchers suspect that the archaeological record attributed to unnamed archaic hominins across Asia, assemblages that don't fit neatly into known categories, may actually belong to the Denisovans. Without skeletal material linked to specific tool assemblages, the attribution cannot be confirmed. A species that lived across an entire continent for 200,000 years is archaeologically almost invisible. Some researchers ask, is it possible that we have been excavating Denisovan sites for a century without knowing it, filing their tools under generic labels because we had no name to give them? From a species written in DNA but invisible in stone, we leap to a destruction so total that it erased a dozen civilizations in a single generation and left every archaeologist since fighting over who pulled the trigger. The Sea Peoples. The year is 1200 BCE. The Eastern Mediterranean is the most interconnected place on Earth. Palace economies in Mycenaean Greece, the Hittite Empire, Ugarit, Cyprus, Canaan, and Egypt trade copper, tin, grain, oil, and luxury goods across a network of diplomatic correspondence and merchant shipping lanes that would not be matched again for 2,000 years. Scribes write letters between kings, warehouses overflow, cities of stone rise from the coastlines, and then, within approximately 50 years, almost all of it is gone. The primary visual record of what happened survives on the walls of Ramesses III's mortuary temple at Medine Habu in Luxor, Egypt, constructed around 1180 BCE. The carvings show two massive battles, one on land and one at sea, against a confederation of invaders that Ramesses calls the Peoples of the Sea. The inscriptions name several groups: the Peliset, the Checker, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Weshesh. Men with feathered headdresses and horned helmets, round shields, and straight swords. A visual vocabulary unlike anything in the Egyptian military record before or after. Ramesses claims victory. The temples were still standing when he wrote that. Barely anything else was. Eric Klein, archaeologist and professor at George Washington University, published his landmark account of the Bronze Age collapse in 2014 under the title 1177, BC, the year civilization collapsed. His analysis identified simultaneous disruptions across the eastern Mediterranean, including drought, earthquake activity, disrupted trade networks, internal rebellions, and the movement of destabilized populations converging into a systems collapse that no single actor caused. His framework is currently the dominant academic model. The Ugarit tablets tell the story from the inside. The city of Ugarit in modern Syria was one of the wealthiest trading ports in the ancient world. Its final destruction layer, dated to approximately 1185 BCE, includes a letter from the king of Ugarit to the king of Alashaya in Cyprus that reads, "My father, the enemy ships have been sighted at sea. 7 ships of the enemy have come and done very wicked things to us. The letter was never sent. It was found in a kiln, still being fired for dispatch, when the city burned." Ugarit was never rebuilt. It sits under a Syrian hillside today, exactly where it fell. A 2013 study by Brandon Drake in the Journal of Archaeological Science documented a prolonged drought lasting approximately 300 years beginning around 1200 BCE, using lake core sediment records from across the eastern Mediterranean. The drought would have devastated the grain-dependent palace economies that Bronze Age civilization ran on, creating populations with nothing left to lose and nowhere to stay. Verified Drake's study specifics. The Peliset, one of the named Sea People groups, are widely identified by most scholars as the biblical Philistines. Excavations at Ashkelon and other sites in modern Israel yielded ancient DNA published in Science Advances in 2019, showing European genetic ancestry appearing suddenly in the local population around 1200 BCE. Consistent with migration from the southern European Aegean region, possibly from populations related to Mycenaean Greece or Sardinia. Verify origin identification. Of the cities destroyed in the collapse period, many show evidence of violent burning. Megiddo, Hazor, Lachish, and Ugarit among them. But others, including Mycenae itself, show gradual abandonment, without clear evidence of a violent end. Assyriologist Trevor Bryce has identified at least 4 distinct causes of destruction visible across the collapse zone, suggesting this was not a single conquering wave, but a cascade of connected failures hitting a civilization that had become too interconnected, too specialized, and too brittle to survive any serious disruption. The Hittite Empire had maintained a professional army, a diplomatic service, and an archive of thousands of cuneiform tablets at its capital, Hattusa. It was a superpower for 500 years. It disappeared so completely that its existence was unknown to modern scholarship until excavations began at Hattusa in 1906. 5 centuries of empire, gone within a generation, leaving so little trace that educated Europeans in the 1800s thought the Hittites were a minor biblical footnote. Mainstream scholarship accepts the system's collapse model. The Sea Peoples were both symptom and cause. Destabilized populations turned raiders in a world already fracturing. No single actor brought down the Bronze Age. It was a cascade. But the coordination visible in the Egyptian records is difficult to explain as pure refugee opportunism. The Medinet Habu inscriptions describe simultaneous land and sea assaults by organized military forces with distinctive equipment and apparent logistical capacity. Someone supplied those ships, someone organized those campaigns. Robert Drews, in his 1993 study, The End of the Bronze Age, argued that the military revolution represented by the Sea Peoples, light infantry with slashing swords replacing chariot-dependent armies, was not just a symptom of collapse, but a cause of it. Where some researchers ask, were the Sea Peoples not an unknowable mystery, but a military revolution we simply haven't finished mapping? From burning harbor cities of the ancient Mediterranean, we cross the Atlantic and climb 10,000 feet into cloud forest to find a warrior people whose cliffside cities predated Machu Picchu by 6 centuries and whose physical appearance has never been fully explained. The Chachapoya. The year is 900 CE Viking. Longships are raiding the English coast. The Tang dynasty is fracturing in China. And in the cloud forest of northern Peru, in a landscape of perpetual mist, sheer canyon walls, and valleys so deep that sunlight reaches the floor only at midday, a civilization is reaching its architectural apex in one of the most inaccessible places humans have ever chosen to call home. They are called the Chachapoya. Their Quechua name means people of the clouds. The Inca, who spent 2 decades trying to conquer them and ultimately succeeded only partially, had a different description. It translated roughly to the ones who would not break. Spanish chronicler Pedro Chiesa de Leon Writing in the 1540s and 1550s based on first-hand accounts from Inca informants and Spanish soldiers, described the Chachapoya in terms that no one has ever fully resolved. He called them the most handsome and best-formed people of the Indies and noted their complexions as notably fair relative to other Andean peoples. At least two other 16th-century chroniclers repeated similar observations. Verify specific chronicler references. These descriptions were dismissed for centuries as Spanish fantasy, European projection, or rhetorical convention. Then the mummies started coming out of the cliff faces. Cuelap, the Chachapoya's primary fortress city, sits at approximately 9,840 feet above sea level and contains over 400 circular stone structures enclosed by walls reaching up to 62 feet in height. Radiocarbon dating places its construction at approximately 500 to 900 CE, paper dating Machu Picchu by 600 to 700 years. The total volume of stone in Cuelap's construction has been estimated as 3 times that used in the Great Pyramid of Giza, and it was built not on a plateau, but on a ridgeline in a cloud forest using no wheeled transport and no draft animals. Verify volume comparison. The Chachapoya are best known for their Purun machis, sarcophagi carved and plastered into human form, dressed to stand upright, and fixed to cliff faces at heights of up to 200 feet above the valley floor. The largest known cluster at Karagia consists of 8 sarcophagi, each standing approximately 8 feet tall, their mottled faces staring outward from the rock. How they were installed is not fully understood. The cliff face offers no obvious route. The workers who attach them to the stone at that height use tools and techniques that have not been recovered or reconstructed. Mummy bundles from the Laguna de los Condores site, discovered in 1996 and yielding 219 mummies and approximately 2,000 ceramic vessels, have provided hair samples showing a range from dark brown to auburn, unusual against the near universally black hair of surrounding Andean populations. A 2013 forensic analysis of the Laguna de los Condores hair samples noted the proportion of non-black hair, while cautioning that post-mortem chemical processes can affect pigmentation. Verify study citation. A 2021 archaeogenetic study published in Cell analyzed pre-Columbian Andean populations and found that individuals from the Amazonas region, Chachapoya territory, showed genetic signals distinct from other Andean highland populations, with elevated affinity to lowland Amazonian groups and signals that the authors acknowledged required additional sampling to fully interpret. Verify study specifics. Warren Church, one of the leading Chachapoya specialists, has noted that the population genetics of the cloud forest region is genuinely understudied and that existing interpretations may require revision as more data becomes available. Inca oral history, preserved in Spanish colonial documents, records that after the Chachapoya's eventual subjugation under Tupac Inca Yupanqui in approximately 1470 CE, Inca Emperor Huayna Capac relocated large numbers of Chachapoya warriors through the Maita resettlement system to serve as an elite imperial guard. The fiercest fighters the Inca encountered from the most inaccessible corner of their empire ended up guarding the Inca's own person. That is the kind of reputation that takes generations to earn. The Laguna de los Condores site was looted before archaeologists arrived. Whatever was taken cannot be recovered. The mummies and artifacts that remain are housed at the Lema Bamba Museum. They are extraordinarily well preserved due to high altitude and cold. And the Chachapoya left no written language. Everything we know about them comes from their objects, from Inca accounts of their enemies, and from Spanish accounts of a people the Inca had barely finished subduing when the Europeans arrived. Their own voice is gone. Mainstream anthropology treats the Chachapoya as a culturally distinct Andean highland people who developed in geographic isolation in the cloud forest zone, producing unique architectural and mortuary traditions. Their physical distinctiveness is acknowledged and explained through regional genetic variation. The chronicle descriptions are treated with appropriate skepticism, but the convergence of multiple independent lines of evidence, chronicle descriptions of anomalous physical features, mummy hair samples outside the expected range, genetic signals that don't fit neatly into Andean models, and a fortress city 3 times the mass of the Great Pyramid built in a cloud forest constitutes more than noise. Some researchers ask, do the Chachapoya represent a genetically and culturally distinct lineage of very early South American settlers, a population that arrived before the genetic landscape of the Andes was shaped by later migrations, and whose descendants the Inca encountered at the very end of their empire's expansion? From a people who built their civilization vertically, up cliff faces above the clouds, we drop down to ground level and travel 15,000 years into the past, to a people who figured out something about living together that we didn't think was possible for another 4,000 years. The Natufians. The year is 13,000 BCE. The last ice age is tightening its grip on the northern world. Glaciers cover most of Britain and Scandinavia. The English Channel doesn't exist. There are perhaps a few million humans alive on the planet. Most of them are moving, constantly, following animals and seasons across landscapes that offer no guarantee of tomorrow. In the Levant, in the crescent of land that today encompasses Israel, the Palestinian territories, Lebanon, and western Jordan, something different is beginning. A people are staying. British archaeologist Dorothy Garrod first identified the Natufian culture through excavations at the El Wad Cave on Mount Carmel between 1928 and 1934. The name comes from Wadi al-Natuf, a valley near Jerusalem. What Garrod found, and what subsequent decades of excavation at sites including Ain Malaha, Hayonim Cave, and Abu Huraira have confirmed, demolished the foundational assumption of how civilization begins. The Natufians built permanent, year-round settlements between 3,000 and 4,000 years before the development of agriculture. They were sedentary hunter-gatherers, a combination that the standard model of prehistory insisted should not exist. Ain Malaha, excavated from the 1950s onward, revealed a settlement of approximately 15 circular stone-founded structures housing an estimated 200 to 300 people, dated to approximately 12,500 to 10,200 BCE. The houses had plastered floors and post holes indicating roofed superstructures. This is not a campsite. This is a village, architecturally realized 3,000 years before wheat was domesticated. In 1978, archaeologists at Ain Malaha discovered a burial that became one of the most discussed in prehistoric archaeology. An elderly individual was buried with one hand resting on a puppy, deliberately placed. The burial, dated to approximately 12,000 BCE, is the earliest known evidence of a domesticated or semi-domesticated dog treated as a companion. Before agriculture, before pottery at scale, before virtually everything we associate with complex society, there was already a human being and a dog buried together because someone thought that was how it should be. Amaya Arons Otegui and colleagues published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2018, reporting charred plant remains from the site of Shubaika, one in Jordan, indicating that Natufians were baking a flatbread-like food from wild cereals and club-rush tubers approximately 14,400 years ago. This is the oldest known bread anywhere on Earth. A hunter-gatherer people, 4,000 years before farming, were baking bread. The ingredient was wild. The technique was sophisticated. The intention was deliberate. Natufian mortuary practice at Hynem Cave, excavated by Ofer Bar Yosef and Anna Belfer Cohen, included multiple individuals buried together with grave goods, decorated bone, shell ornaments, animal remains. Some sites show the deliberate removal and secondary burial of skulls, separated from their associated bodies and placed in specific spatial arrangements, suggesting ancestor veneration or some form of skull ritual farming community. That should be impossible. That is what the evidence shows. A 2016 ancient DNA study led by Iosif Lazaridis at Harvard identified the Natufians as descended from a basal Eurasian lineage, a population that split from other Eurasian groups very early in the modern human dispersal, and is not found in pure form in any living population. They contributed ancestry to the early European farmers who later spread agriculture across the continent. The people who invented permanent settlement before farming later contributed their genes to the people who brought farming to Europe. The chain runs forward in unexpected ways. Mainstream archaeology accepts the Natufians fully. Ofer Bar Yosef and others frame their sedentism as the product of exceptional resource density in the Levantine environment at the end of the Ice Age, particularly abundant wild cereals and gazelle herds. The Younger Dryas cooling event around 12,900 BCE, which dried the Levant catastrophically, is accepted as the likely stress that eventually pushed Natufian descendants toward active plant cultivation. Drought, not ingenuity, may have invented farming. But the Natufians challenge something deeper than a timeline. If permanent settlement, symbolic mortuary ritual, long-distance trade, and technological innovation can all emerge without agriculture, the causal chain used to explain civilization's origins needs fundamental revision. Jacques Cauvin, in The Birth of the Gods and the Origins of Agriculture, published in 2000, argued that what changed first was not subsistence strategy but cognition, that shifts in symbolic thinking preceded and enabled both sedentism and farming. The dog burial isn't just moving. It is evidence of a radically new relationship between humans and other species, one that made the domestication of plants and animals psychologically conceivable. Some researchers ask, did civilization begin not with the first planted seed, but with the first deliberate burial of a dog? From villages that rewrote the rules of civilization in the ancient Levant, we cross the Pacific and climb high into the Peruvian Andes, where surgeons were opening living human skulls with tools sharp enough to rival modern surgical steel and sending their patients home to live for decades more. The Wari surgeons. The year is 700 CE. In medieval Europe, physicians are bleeding patients with leeches and interpreting illness as divine punishment. In the highlands of Peru, at the center of the Wari Empire near modern Ayacucho, at an elevation of 8,900 feet, surgeons are performing cranial operations with survival rates that would not be matched in the Western world for another 1,200 years. The evidence is not disputed. It is sitting in museum collections across Peru and the United States. The bone grew back. The patient lived. Hundreds of times. John Verano, bioarchaeologist at Tulane University, has spent decades analyzing trepanned skulls from Andean archaeological sites. His book Holes in the Head: The Art and Archaeology of Trepanation in Ancient Peru, published in 2016 by Dumbarton Oaks, represents the most comprehensive analysis of the record to date. His findings across more than 800 specimens document a pattern of increasing surgical skill over time that has few parallels in the pre-modern world. Verify Verano's specific specimen count. the numbers are almost impossible to absorb. Early Andean trepanation examples from approximately 400 BCE show roughly 40% of patients surviving based on bone healing evidence around the surgical opening. By the Wari period, between 600 and 1000 CE, that figure had risen to approximately 80 to 90%. The American Civil War, fought with metal instruments in the 19th century, produced trepanation survival rates of approximately 50%. A pre-contact Andean culture using stone tools in the mountains of Peru achieved surgical outcomes that 19th century American medicine could not equal. Verify Verano's specific numbers and Civil War comparison. Andean surgeons used at least 4 distinct trepanation techniques: scraping, in which a tool progressively abrades the bone; grooving, cutting a circular groove until the section breaks free; boring and cutting, drilling a series of holes and connecting them with incisions; and straight cutting, a single-pass blade incision. The choice of technique correlates with the type of injury and the location on the skull, implying a systematic diagnostic approach. This is not improvisation. This is a procedural protocol developed and refined over generations. Many trepan skulls show evidence of prior cranial trauma, fractures consistent with mace or club impacts, the standard weapons of Andean warfare documented in Wari period iconography. Surgeons appear to have been operating specifically to relieve pressure from depressed skull fractures and to clean infected wounds. Those are exactly the medical indications for trepanation recognized by modern neurosurgeons. Without knowing germ theory, without a concept of intracranial pressure as a physiological mechanism, Wari surgeons had arrived at the correct clinical indication for the procedure. The primary surgical tool was obsidian, volcanic glass capable of producing a cutting edge at the atomic scale. Obsidian blades can achieve an edge of approximately 3 nanometers, compared to approximately 15 to 20 nanometers for modern surgical steel under electron microscopy. Verify nanometer comparison. Obsidian sources in the Andes were traded across enormous distances, identified through geochemical sourcing studies. The material was valuable. It was valued specifically because it was the sharpest cutting substance available on Earth. Wari surgeons were using the optimal material for their task. Some specimens in Verano's analysis show evidence of multiple trepanation events on the same skull. Distinct healed zones and distinct fresh-cut margins on a single cranium indicate that the same individual underwent the procedure more than once, survived at least the first surgery, healed and returned or was returned to the operating table. One specimen shows 3 separate trepanation events. The patient survived at least 2 of them. The anesthetic, if any existed, is unknown. The Andes produce coca, the plant from which cocaine is derived, which has demonstrable local anesthetic properties when applied directly to tissue. Coca use in Andean ritual and medicine is extensively documented from later periods. Whether it was applied to surgical wounds, in what form, and in what concentration during the Wari period is speculative. No direct evidence of surgical anesthesia has been recovered. Patients may have been conscious. We cannot say. Mainstream bioarchaeology accepts the Wari trepanation record without reservation. The high survival rates are explained through cumulative learning, generations of practitioners refining technique through observation and practice, combined with the exceptional sharpness of obsidian tools, the cold, high-altitude environment's possible role in reducing infection rates, and careful post-operative wound management. These are reasonable, well-supported explanations. But cumulative learning is a description of a result, not a mechanism. The jump from 40 to 90% survival over roughly 1,000 years implies a capacity to understand why patients were dying and to change behavior accordingly. to identify causal relationships between procedural choices and outcomes, and to transmit that understanding reliably across generations. That is the functional definition of medical knowledge achieved without writing. Some researchers ask, did the Wari and their predecessors possess an empirical medical epistemology, a systematic understanding of cause and effect in wound management that operated without theoretical framework but produced outcomes indistinguishable from one? From surgeons who mastered the human skull. In the high Andes, we travel north and east across an ocean to an island archipelago at the edge of the Asian continent, where a people who look nothing like their neighbors have been asking for centuries where they came from, and where science has only recently given them a partial answer. The Ainu. The year is 15,000 BCE. Japan is not yet an island. A land bridge still connects the archipelago to the Asian mainland, and the people who have been moving through these islands for thousands of years are already here, already fishing the rivers, already burying their dead with ritual, already developing the ceramic technology that will eventually produce the oldest known pottery on Earth. They are the Jomon. They are the ancestors of the Ainu, and they are about to be replaced so thoroughly, so completely, that the country that replaced them will spend centuries pretending they never existed. Japan formally recognized the Ainu as an indigenous people in 2019, making it one of the last developed nations to acknowledge its own indigenous population. The recognition came after more than a century of official policy that classified the Ainu as assimilated Japanese citizens, prohibited their traditional practices, and seized their land under the Meiji government's 1899 Former Aborigines Protection Act, a law not repealed until 1997. 10,000 years of prior occupation. 1 century to nearly erase them. The law that did it stood for almost 100 years. A landmark 2021 study published in Science by Gakahari and colleagues analyzed genome-wide data from 12 ancient Jomon individuals and 235 modern Japanese individuals. Modern Yamato Japanese, the dominant population, derive approximately 71 to 80% of their ancestry from Yayoi migrants who arrived from the Korean peninsula and mainland China beginning roughly 3,000 years ago, and only 13 to 20% from the Jomon baseline. The Ainu derive approximately 66% of their ancestry from the Jomon. Verify percentages. The Ainu are not a Japanese minority. They are the remnant of the people who were there before Japan. The Ainu genetic profile shows closer affinity to ancient Siberian populations, specifically ancient North Eurasians, than to any living East Asian group. A 2019 genetic study found that the Ainu also share signals with ancient Native American populations, consistent with both descending from the same ancestral Siberian population that spread in different directions during the last ice age, one branch crossing into the Americas, another moving into the Japanese archipelago. The Ainu and the first Americans may share a common origin in an ice age Siberian population. Physically, the Ainu are remarkable in the context of East Asia. Traditional Ainu men are noted for heavy beards and substantial body hair, highly unusual among East Asian populations where facial hair is typically sparse. Ainu facial morphology, including brow ridge prominence, eye shape, and cranial form, clusters closer to Europeans and Australasians than to neighboring Japanese, Chinese, or Korean populations in craniometric analyses. Verify craniometric claim specifics. These are not subtle differences. They are immediately visible and were documented by every European visitor who encountered the Ainu from the 17th century onward. The Ainu language is a complete isolate. It has no demonstrated relationship to any other language on Earth. Not to Japanese, not to Korean, not to any Siberian or Pacific language family. Despite living in Japan for 15,000 years, the Ainu language shows no signs of deep structural borrowing from Japonic languages, and Japonic shows no Ainu substrate. Two populations in proximity for centuries, and, linguistically, they remained entirely separate. That kind of impermeability implies either extreme social segregation or a period of contact so ancient that any linguistic exchange has been completely obscured. The Jomon period archaeological sites representing the Ainu's ancestral population include the Oda Yamamoto Afudagiwai site in Aomori Prefecture, where ceramic shards have been radiocarbon dated to approximately 16,500 to 15,000 years before present. These are the oldest confirmed pottery fragments anywhere on Earth. A hunter-gatherer people with no agriculture produced ceramic containers 3,000 years before any other culture managed it. The Jomon, and by ancestry the Ainu, invented something that history's standard model assigns to settled agricultural societies. The current registered Ainu population in Japan is approximately 13,000 individuals. Estimates of those with Ainu heritage, including unregistered individuals who have assimilated, range as high as 200,000. The gap between those numbers reflects not biology but social pressure, the consequence of a century of official policy that made Ainu identity a liability. People erase themselves to survive. Their descendants are still sorting out what was lost. Mainstream genetics and anthropology fully support the Ainu as descendants of Japan's Jomon inhabitants, with the population replacement driven by the Yayoi agricultural migration. The framework is accepted. The demographics are confirmed. Japan's 2019 recognition of Ainu indigenous status is the political acknowledgement of what science has established. But the depth of the Ainu's genetic and cultural distinctiveness from surrounding East Asian populations raises a question that goes beyond Japanese politics. The Jomon occupied the Japanese archipelago for 15,000 years before the Yayoi arrived. They developed pottery, complex mortuary ritual, long-distance trade, and a cosmological system elaborate enough to structure every aspect of life. Then, within a few centuries of the Yayoi arrival, they were demographically overwhelmed. The same pattern as the Neolithic farmers of Europe. Complex, non-agricultural or semi-agricultural people replaced by incoming agriculturalists. Some researchers ask, is there something about the social organization of farming societies, some structural advantage in population density or military capacity, that makes them almost inevitably dominant over even sophisticated non-farming peoples when the two populations come into direct contact? From a people still living with the consequences of a prehistoric replacement, we ascend to the roof of the world, where a civilization at impossible altitude defied every limit of human physiology and built monuments whose construction has not been fully explained. Tiwanaku. The year is 500 CE. Rome has collapsed in the west. The Byzantine Empire is consolidating. On the Bolivian Altiplano, at an elevation of 12,549 feet above sea level, where the air contains 40% less oxygen than at sea level and killing frosts can strike in any month, a city is reaching its peak. The Tiwanaku are not surviving at altitude. They are thriving. Running an empire, managing a trade network spanning from the Pacific coast to the Amazon basin, and cutting stone to tolerances that the archaeologists who study it acknowledge they have not yet fully explained. Clark Erickson of the University of Pennsylvania began documenting Tiwanaku raised field agriculture, called sucacullis, in the Lake Titicaca Basin in the 1980s. His reconstruction experiments, conducted with local Aymara farmers using traditional methods, produced results that stopped agricultural scientists. The ancient system yielded harvests 8 to 14 times higher than modern techniques using the same land under the same conditions. The raised fields create thermal mass. Water channels between the ridges absorb solar heat during the day and release it slowly through the freezing night, creating microclimates that protect crops from the frosts that make conventional altiplano farming a gamble. The Tiwanaku had engineered a microclimate. Empirically, without theoretical framework, they had solved the temperature problem that makes the world's highest plateau nearly unfarmable. The Gateway of the Sun, carved from a single block of andesite measuring approximately 9.8 feet tall by 12.8 feet wide and weighing approximately 10 metric tons, stands at the ceremonial center of Tiwanaku and is decorated with a carved deity figure surrounded by 48 winged attendants arranged in 3 rows. The carving at the headdress elements achieves tolerances of approximately 1 to 2 millimeters across the stone's face. Verify tolerance measurement. This was achieved with stone and bronze tools at 12,000 feet by workers whose lungs were operating at 60% of sea-level oxygen intake. Pumapunku, a ceremonial platform approximately 550 meters from the main Tiwanaku Ceremonial Center, contains stone blocks of red sandstone and gray andesite that include H-shaped interlocking elements, internally carved right-angle channels, and surface finishes smooth enough to reflect light. The andesite blocks were sourced from the Copacabana Peninsula, approximately 56 miles from the site across Lake Titicaca. Verify distance. The largest single block at Pumapunku weighs approximately 131 metric tons. Verify weight. It was transported without wheeled vehicles and without draft animals capable of moving that mass. The mechanism of transport has not been definitively reconstructed. John Janusek of Vanderbilt University, through strontium isotope analysis of human skeletal remains at Tiwanaku, found that the city's population included individuals from geographically diverse origins across the Andes, drawn from hundreds of miles away. Tiwanaku was a genuinely cosmopolitan city at 12,000 feet, drawing pilgrims, workers, and residents from the Pacific coast, the Amazon foothills, and the high plateau simultaneously. The city's trade. Network carried spondylus shell from the coast of Ecuador more than 1,500 miles away, obsidian from multiple Andean sources, and Tiwanaku-style ceramics across modern Bolivia, Peru, Chile, and Argentina. The Kalasasaya platform, Tiwanaku's central ceremonial structure, is aligned to cardinal directions with a precision suggesting deliberate astronomical orientation. Its sunken temple court's interior walls are lined with hundreds of carved stone faces, each distinct, representing individuals from across the Tiwanaku world. They stare outward from the stone, specific people, not generic figures, memorialized in the walls of a ritual space at altitude. An empire with no writing system recorded its population in stone faces instead. Matthew Binford and colleagues, in a study published in Science in 1997, linked Tiwanaku's collapse around 1000 CE to a prolonged drought documented in Lake Titicaca sediment cores lasting approximately 100 to 200 years. The raised field system, which depended on controlled water management, failed when the water table dropped. The most sophisticated agricultural system on the Altiplano collapsed not to conquest, but to drought. A civilization that had solved the cold could not solve the dry. Mainstream archaeology accepts Tiwanaku as a genuine state-level society whose achievements reflect long-term ecological adaptation, sophisticated labor organization through the Amida system, and a religious ideology powerful enough to integrate diverse populations across a vast territory. The stone transport is explained through large-scale organized labor using log rollers, ramps, and reed boat lake transport. These explanations are reasonable and well supported. But Alexei Vranich of UC Berkeley, one of the leading Puma-Punku specialists, has acknowledged that the precision and scale of Puma-Punku's construction represent engineering challenges that have not been fully explained. Organized labor moves mass. It does not automatically produce 1 millimeter tolerances in andesite at altitude. The tools that produced those surfaces have not been recovered. The technique has not been reconstructed to the level that fully accounts for the output. Some researchers ask, did the Tiwanaku possess a specialized class of stone technicians whose techniques were so narrowly transmitted that they vanished with the collapse of the culture that sustained them, leaving us with results we can measure but not replicate? From an empire that defied altitude on the roof of South America, we ride east and north across the steppe to the moment when a people on horseback changed everything about warfare, migration, and power, and left behind a genetic mystery that modern science has only deepened: the bow tie. The year is 3500 BCE. The Bronze Age is beginning in the Near East. The wheel has just appeared somewhere in the steppe, or Mesopotamia, and on the flat, wind-scoured grassland of what is now northern Kazakhstan, a group of people are doing something for the first time in human history. They are climbing onto a horse and staying there. That moment when some individual in the Akmola steppe first settled their weight onto a horse's back, and the horse, for reasons that remain somewhat mysterious, did not immediately throw them, changed warfare, trade, migration, and the distribution of power across Eurasia for the next 5,000 years. And the horses that were tamed there in northern Kazakhstan are not the ancestors of any horse alive today. Viktor Zybert of the Russian Academy of Sciences led excavations at the Botai and Krasny Yar sites in northern Kazakhstan beginning in the 1980s. The site at Krasny Yar contains the structural remains of at least 158 pit houses covering approximately 15 hectares, a substantial semi-permanent settlement. The faunal assemblage, the animal bones in the midden deposits, is dominated by horse remains to an extraordinary degree. Over 90% of all animal bones at the site are horse. This is not a culture that occasionally hunted horses. The entire material economy of the Botai was organized around them. The total number of horse bone fragments at Botai and related sites exceeds 300,000. At a site population of perhaps a few hundred to a few thousand people, that number implies a relationship with horses at massive, sustained scale, one that looks far more like herding than hunting. Sandra Olsen of the Carnegie Museum of Natural History began analyzing Botai horse remains and artifacts in the 1990s, documenting bit wear on premolar teeth, asymmetric wear patterns on horse teeth consistent with the use of a bit or rope bridle, matching the damage patterns produced by modern horse bits under controlled conditions. Ceramic vessel residue from the Botai site, analyzed using gas chromatography mass spectrometry by Alan Outram and colleagues and published in Science in 2009, contained lipid residues consistent with mare's milk, specifically the fatty acid profiles of fermented mare's milk, kaumis. This is the earliest known evidence of milking any animal, predating dairy farming in Europe by approximately 1,000 years. The Botai were not just riding horses. They were drinking them, fermenting their milk, building a subsistence economy around a single domesticated species before the practice of animal domestication was widespread. Outram and colleagues also documented cribbing behavior in Botai horse remains, and the tendency of confined or tethered horses to bite on hard surfaces out of stress. Cribbing is associated with captivity, not free-range animals. Combined with the milk residues and the bit wear, the behavioral, biochemical, and osteological evidence all point in the same direction. The Botai were keeping horses in controlled conditions, drinking their milk, and directing their movement with some form of bridle or bit. Horse domestication confirmed at 3500 BCE, approximately 1,000 years earlier than any other evidence. In 2018, Charlene Gaunitz and colleagues published a landmark study in Science analyzing the genomes of 42 ancient and modern horse specimens. The result was devastating to the simple narrative. The modern domestic horse, Equus caballus, does not descend from the Botai horses. Modern domestic horses derive from a separate domestication event that occurred approximately 2000 BCE, somewhere else on the steppe, in a population related to the Yamnaya expansion. The Botai horse lineage was not the ancestor of the horses that carry humanity today. It was replaced. The Botai horse's descendants are Przewalski's horse, long celebrated as the last truly wild species, which turned out to be a feral population descended from the Botai's domesticated animals. The wild horses are domesticated. The pioneering domesticators left no horse legacy. The Botai themselves were genetically replaced. Ancient DNA analysis by David Reich's lab found that the Botai belonged to a distinct steppe population that was subsequently overwhelmed genetically and culturally by the Yamnaya-related expansions moving eastward from approximately 3000 BCE onward. The people who first rode horses were replaced by the people who, inspired by or descended from the same steppe environment, became the greatest horse-based empire builders in history. The Botai pioneered domestication. Someone else inherited the world it made. The mainstream archaeology accepts the Botai as the earliest confirmed evidence of horse domestication. The 2018 Gaunitz study is established science, its findings incorporated into the current understanding of horse domestication history. The question of where and when the modern domestic horse was domesticated remains open, with recent genetic evidence pointing toward the Pontic-Caspian steppe. But the discovery that Przewalski's horses are actually feral descendants of Botai domesticated animals raises a question about wildness itself. Humans have been shaping horse populations for so long and so completely that the species we designated as the last wild horse is itself a product of human domestication and subsequent release. Some researchers ask, is there any such thing as a wild horse anymore? And if the original domesticators, the Botai, were replaced by a culture whose horses were themselves a second separate domestication event, what does it mean that the modern world runs, metaphorically and literally, on horses that came not from the first people to ride, but from whoever replaced them? From the wind-swept steppe where humans first learned to ride, we descend to the very bottom of the inhabitable world, at the last people, at the last land, surviving conditions that Charles Darwin himself called impossible. The Yaghan. The year is 8000 BCE. Glaciers are retreating from the northern hemisphere. Humans are pushing into the final corners of the habitable Earth. Most of those corners have something in common. They are warm enough, or warm enough most of the year, to sustain human life without physiological extremity. The Yaghan chose differently or found themselves at the end of a continent and stayed. They settled the southernmost archipelago on Earth, the Tierra del Fuego, the land of fire, a name given by Europeans who saw the Yaghan's signal fires from the sea and misunderstood what kind of fire kept people alive there. It was not the fire outside. It was the fire inside. In 1832, Charles Darwin looked from the deck of the HMS Beagle at the Yaghan standing on the shore in sleet and wind, nearly naked, covered in animal grease, and wrote in his journal that he had never seen humans who astonished him so completely, not because of their technology, because they were alive, in temperatures approaching freezing, without insulation, without any of the external thermal management that European physiology required. He wrote of a woman nursing an infant on the open shore, sleet falling and thawing on her bare skin and on the skin of the baby, and both of them perfectly indifferent to it. Darwin found this more disturbing than anything else he saw on the entire voyage. Physiologist P.F. Scholander and colleagues conducted metabolic studies of Yaghan individuals in the mid-20th century and found basal metabolic rates approximately 160% of European norms, the body generating sufficient internal heat to maintain core temperature in near-freezing conditions without external insulation that European physiology required. Verify Scholander citation and percentage. This is not a trivial cultural adaptation. This is a physiological change, encoded over generations of selection, in which the body itself became the insulation. The Yaghan's biology had diverged from the baseline in a measurable, reproducible way in response to an environment that should have made permanent habitation impossible. The Yaghan diet was almost exclusively marine. Sea lions, seals, fish, mussels, barnacles, and birds. Women dove in near-freezing water to collect shellfish, often for extended periods, while men hunted sea mammals from bark canoes approximately 15 to 18 feet long. Stable isotope analysis of Yaghan's skeletal remains confirms a diet so dominated by marine protein that their bone chemistry resembles that of marine mammals more than it does most human populations. High-fat marine diet provided the caloric density needed to sustain a metabolism running at 160% of normal. The sea fed the fire. The Yaghan navigated the most dangerous waters in the world without compass and in permanent overcast. The channels and straits of the Tierra del Fuego archipelago, where the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans converge, produced weather conditions that killed European sailors regularly. The Yaghan moved through them in bark canoes over distances of hundreds of miles using navigational knowledge transmitted entirely through oral tradition accumulated across 8,000 years of living in those waters. That knowledge is almost entirely gone. The Yaghan language is notable among linguists for the psychological complexity of its vocabulary. One word, mamihla pina tapai, has no equivalent in English and describes a look shared between two people, each wishing that the other would initiate something both desire. A language of that psychological nuance, from a people Darwin's contemporaries called the most primitive on Earth, was a piece of evidence that should have complicated the hierarchy. Darwin himself, to his credit, acknowledged that the gap between Yaghan intellectual capacity and his own was far smaller than the gap in their material circumstances. He brought 4 of them to England to test the theory. They learned English in months. One of them, Jemmy Button, returned to Tierra del Fuego and went back to being Yaghan within weeks. Archaeological evidence from Yaghan shell middens, the accumulated kitchen refuse of shellfish, bones, and discarded tools preserved along island shores throughout the Beagle Channel region, has been radiocarbon dated to approximately 8,000 years ago at the earliest confirmed sites. The middens show a culture using the same basic technology and food strategies for 8 millennia. The same tools, the same shellfish, the same canoes. That is not stagnation. That is optimization. They found a solution to one of the most extreme habitation challenges on Earth, and they maintained it unchanged for 8,000 years because it worked. The population collapse of the Yaghan is one of the fastest in the historical record. Estimated at approximately 3,000 individuals at first European contact in the 16th century, the population had fallen to approximately 970 by an 1884 census conducted by missionary Thomas Bridges to approximately 170 by 1913 and fewer than 100 by the mid-20th century. Disease drove the collapse. Measles, tuberculosis, common European illnesses that the Yagan immune system had never encountered. People who had survived 10,000 years of sub-Antarctic cold were killed in a century by pathogens carried by people who came to save them. As of the most recent available records, one fully fluent native Yagan speaker remained alive. Cristina Calderon, born in 1928, living on Navarino Island in Chilean Tierra del Fuego. Verify current status. When she goes, the language goes. 8,000 years of accumulated knowledge about how to live at the end of the world encoded in a grammar and vocabulary with no relatives anywhere on Earth will be gone. Some of it has been recorded, most of it has not. Mainstream science accepts the Yaghan story fully, elevated basal metabolism as a product of generational physiological selection, high-fat marine diet providing necessary caloric density, sophisticated ecological knowledge enabling sustained habitation of an extreme environment, and population collapse from epidemic disease in an immunologically naive population. The framework is clear and well evidenced, but the metabolic difference is worth sitting with. Through the same principle that gave Tibetans the Denisovan EPAS1 variant, a physiological adaptation to an environmental extreme, operated in the Yagan in a different direction and through a different mechanism. Two populations in two of the most extreme habitation environments on Earth both became physically different from the rest of humanity in response to where they chose or found themselves to live. The Tibetan Plateau and the bottom of South America. Both pushed the human body past what the textbook baseline predicts. Both produced people who were, biologically, not quite the same as the rest of us. Some researchers ask, how many other populations, in how many other extreme environments over how many thousands of years, underwent similar physiological divergence, and how much of that divergence vanished with them when contact came? 10 people, 10 civilizations, 10 stories that the standard version of history mentions, if at all, in footnotes. Look at what they share. The Yamnaya moved across a continent and left their genetics in the bodies of people who have never heard their name. The Denisovans ranged across all of Asia for 200,000 years and are known from a finger. The Sea Peoples toppled a dozen empires and remain unidentified. The Chachapoya built cliff cities above the clouds and left behind faces that no one has fully explained. The Natufians baked bread and buried their dogs 15,000 years before anyone thought either was possible. The Wari surgeons opened human skulls and sent their patients home to live for decades with tools and outcomes that 19th century surgery couldn't match. The Ainu held the oldest pottery tradition on Earth and were nearly erased from the country that replaced them. Tiwanaku ran an empire at altitude with agricultural technology that outperforms modern methods today. The Botai rode horses first and left no horse descendants. The Yagan survived at the end of the world for 8,000 years and were killed in a century by a cold. The pattern is not that these civilizations were primitive or savage or somehow beneath the cultures that followed them. The pattern is the opposite. These are people operating at the limits of what human intelligence, adaptability, and physical capacity can produce without the tools that we assume are prerequisites for achievement. They are evidence that the prerequisites are wrong, that complexity, sophistication, and knowledge can emerge from conditions we have categorized as insufficient, that the standard timeline of human development is a simplification that leaves out most of the interesting material. Mainstream archaeology knows most of this. The Yamnaya migration is peer-reviewed. The Denisovan genome is Nobel-validated. The Wari survival rates are in Verano's published datasets. The Botai milk residues are in Science. The issue is not suppression, it is prioritization. Academic attention flows toward the well-mapped and the easily categorized. What doesn't fit neatly gets filed in specialist journals that most people never read. What you have done, sitting here through 10 civilizations that most people walk past in museums without looking, is refused the simplification. You have insisted on the complicated version. That is not nothing. The people who ask the harder questions are the ones who eventually force the revisions. History is not a finished document, it is a living argument. The Yagan and the Botai and the Yamnaya and the Denisovans are all still making their case, from bones, from genes, from stone, from the metabolic difference between a woman nursing an infant in sleep and a woman who would have died doing it. The question they are asking, all of them in aggregate, is simple. It is, what were we actually capable of? If you want to know the answer, subscribe. And tell us in the comments, which of these 10 civilizations shook you the most and why? 10,000 years ago, a child was buried with a dog in the Levant, and someone stood over the grave long enough to make it deliberate. A finger. Bone in Siberian dirt contained an entire vanished humanity. A woman at the end of the world held her child in the sleet, and the world kept turning. These people did not know they were making history. They were surviving. They were adapting. They were refusing the conditions that should have stopped them. That refusal, repeated across 10,000 years and every continent, is what we are. Subscribe, and keep asking why.